So, good afternoon, everyone. By way of introduction, my name is Emily White, and I'm here presenting on behalf of a risk analytics firm called Maplecroft. Now, in this very brief session, I just have 15 minutes, probably now about 10 minutes to talk to you, I'm going to talk about global datasets for disaster risk management. And we have an example of one here on the slide. This is Maplecroft's Global Seismic Risk Index that you're looking at there. So, I want to talk about global data sets, and what I'd like to do is I'd like to share with you a specific example of how value can be derived from global data sets for disaster risk management. But we'll come to that a bit later. In the interim, what I'd like to do is perhaps set the scene a little bit and talk about the context in which we work. So my perception of the current context in which we work is that the data challenge is evolving for disaster risk management. Now, I think there is perhaps been acceptance, been acknowledgement for some time that the best types of decision-making in DRM are evidence-based, and therefore that risk information is absolutely critical as it forms the body of evidence that supports that decision-making process. And there is acknowledgement that data is applicable and can be applied indeed across all the different pillars of disaster risk management, from disaster risk reduction through to preparedness, and indeed through to response and recovery as well. So risk information is a critical foundation of disaster risk management. It takes many different forms. I've pulled out a couple of examples here, borrowed from organizations, as you can see on the bottom there, just to illustrate the different forms of risk information that are being put to use across the different pillars of DRM, if you like. I'll perhaps draw attention to the picture at the bottom left there. Now, this is actually borrowed from INGC, who you may perhaps be aware of. So this is the disaster risk management body of Mozambique. And this gives us a very good example of how INGC are using risk information to better prepare for disasters. So what we're actually looking at here at the bottom left-hand picture there, we're looking at scenario modeling for floods. So we're looking at flood modeling in advance of the rainy season. And what this risk information allows is it allows INGC to better prepare for the season ahead. It allows them to pre-position more effectively. So that's one example. Perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, another example would be within disaster risk reduction. So if we think about investment in disaster risk reduction, we can think of the role of, say, risk assessment in cost-benefit analysis. So through risk information, by assessing risk, we can consider, for example, the cost benefits of retrofitting a school. And by understanding the risk to which that school is exposed, by understanding the potential impacts, we can look at what the return is on that investment. So these are some of the different ways in which risk information is critical to disaster risk management. Now, what do I mean by the fact that the data challenge is evolving? Well, what I mean is it's evolving from a challenge perhaps of production of disaster risk information to a challenge of stewardship of disaster risk information. So, as I mentioned before, there's growing acceptance of the role of disaster risk information in effective disaster risk management. And what this has done, it's really shone the spotlight on the importance of data. So we're seeing growing investment in production of risk information. There are numerous, I'm sure you're familiar with many, but there are numerous initiatives at many different scales, at the global level, at the national level, at the subnational level. Many stakeholders are producing risk information. And what this leads to is a growing body of information that needs to be managed. And this is where data stewardship starts to become a more important challenge, if you like, for DRM practitioners. Now, I'm going to caveat this slide here and this statement with the fact that, of course, I do not mean to imply that we've completely overcome the challenge of production of disaster risk information. There are still gaps in the data record. There are still many cases where the information simply is not available to support disaster risk management. However, as we're seeing this growing body of information, we do have to look towards data stewardship to make sure that we're getting the most out of that data. Now, what do I mean by data stewardship? What I mean is broadly speaking, the management of that information. So the information needs to be consolidated. It needs to be made accessible. Where there are different data sets, we need to ensure that they are interoperable so they can be used together. And most importantly, we need to make sure that risk information isn't produced and then shoved into a cupboard somewhere, that it is, in fact, supporting decision making. And so the question that I really wanted to put to you all this afternoon is the question of how can we derive value from the data investment to date. So there has been a massive investment in the production of data for disaster risk information. I'm sure you're familiar with the fantastic data sets that are out there, a lot of global data sets, a lot of national, as I mentioned. So how can we derive value from these data sets? Well, there are perhaps an infinite number of answers to that question, but I'd like to talk about one today. And this is through the production of quantitative risk indices. And I will go into that. So this is an area that my firm, Maplecroft, has been engaged in for a number of years. And the idea there is to take global data sets, to manipulate them, to repackage them, and to turn them into something that is universal and accessible and consistent. This is what we mean by quantitative risk indices. And this is a process that can be applied to most data sets. So what is being done currently at Maplecroft is we take global data sets, we look at the distribution of data, and again, this could be hazard data, it could be vulnerability exposure, and we fit to that distribution a risk score. And we use a common risk scoring system, it's very simple, 0 to 10, across all of these data sets. Now what that does is it provides us with a very easy way to compare risk between countries and between regions within a country. The other benefit of doing that is that it increases the interoperability of data sets. So it allows us to overlay different issues on top of each other to create a view of the intersection of those issues. And I'll go into that a bit more in a moment because it can be quite complex. But this is essentially the methodology that I want to present to you today. It's a methodology that is designed to try and derive value out of the fantastic catalogue of global data sets that exist out there at the moment for disaster risk information. And this is what the output of that process can look like. So this is Maplecroft's Economic Exposure to Natural Hazards Index from 2013. Now this is a global index, so if I zoomed out, you could see a picture of the whole world. But I've zoomed in because I want to show you the resolution and some of the features here. Now what we're looking at is the output of that process. So multiple data sets here have had this risk scoring applied, and they've been overlaid. We've used GIS techniques to overlay them. And through this, we can view the intersection of economic exposure and natural hazard risk. So what we're looking at here for Southeast Asia is we're looking at the overlay of flood risk, a flood risk index, a seismic risk index, and also a tropical cyclone risk index. And on top of that, we have economic exposure. And you can see the concentrations of economic exposure obviously are picked out, but also the distribution of peril as well. So we can see, for example, for flood risk, the Yangtze River is quite apparent there, cutting through the middle of China. So this is what the outputs of that process can look like. Now, there are many ways to visualize risk. We can pull data sets together in many different forms. What makes that process a bit more standardized and simple is the fact that we have a common framework to work to. Now, this framework will be familiar to anyone working in risk assessment, but this is the framework within which we set our parameters for the viewing of risk. So the common understanding is that disaster risk is the intersection of hazard, so the physical hazard itself, the exposure, which could be assets or population, and then vulnerability, which is essentially the reaction of those exposures to the hazard. So this is a common framework within which we operate. And Maplecroft's translation of that looks something like this. So here we have a series of indices listed that describe a spectrum of hazard exposure and vulnerability. Now, combined together, this can give us a picture of risk. It can tell us a story about risk. So on the far left-hand side, we have the physical peril itself. We have a range of perils listed there. I won't go through them. We can look at exposure relative to the distribution of that hazard. I've shown you the economic exposure. We can overlay population as well. And then we can look at vulnerability in many different ways. Now, the Maplecroft view of vulnerability is in fact the inverse. So we look at resilience, we look at socioeconomic resilience. And we look across issues such as community vulnerability, institutional robustness, and infrastructure fragility. We use global data sets. We apply our risk scoring methodology so that they're interoperable, and we overlay them onto each other to give us a picture, to tell us a story about the risk. So feeding into these different thematic areas are global data sets. And I'd like to show you one, if I can get it up there. So this is a poverty density index. It's been created by Maplecroft. So what we're looking at here are concentrations of poverty. So if you imagine a way to derive value from global data sets here is to take this poverty density index, and perhaps you want to look at the intersection of poverty concentration with the intersection of drought risk. So we can take, again, a high resolution drought risk data set, and we can use GIS techniques to overlay the two and look at where they coincide. So where are the highest concentrations of poverty coinciding with the highest drought risk? And that can tell us a story about risk overall. So that's just one way to visualize risk. So we're using poverty density effectively there as our exposure and vulnerability component, and drought is the hazard component that I mentioned. And this is the Maplecroft Socioeconomic Resilience Index, which draws in that poverty density index that I just showed you, and the other issues that I mentioned there, so institutional robustness and infrastructure fragility as well. So what is the point? Why do we care about global data sets? Why do we spend time manipulating, repackaging, making these data sets interoperable so we can overlay them onto each other? Well, the answer is that it gives us a global picture of risk. So by overlaying data sets, by making data sets interoperable, so manipulating them in such a way that we can create composite indices across multiple issues, we can create a very accessible view of risk. And that's what we have here. So this is a view of risk overall. The countries are ranked according to risk. We've selected a couple of drivers of risk to combine into an overall index. The important thing here is that these methodologies allow a relative view of risk. What they allow is the positioning of countries relative to each other on issues of interest, or the positioning of regions within a country relative to each other, again, across these areas of interest. That was all I wanted to share with you today. We do have more information on our website, and that's it from me. Thank you.